Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Assemblymember Robert Rivas, Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce, Gilroy Chamber of Commerce, and California Consulting Grant Writing Workshop webinar. That was a lot. We are excited today to present this information to you. And due to the large number of people, we're going to lay down just a little bit of the ground rules just to get started. Your cameras and microphones are turned off. That's just to create more bandwidth and a little bit less confusion. And we're going to ask that you keep all your questions and write them in the chat box. Brittany is going to be monitoring them, and I believe all of us are co-hosts, all panelists are co-hosts, and we'll be able to see all your questions. So we will definitely get to those during the question and answer section. Also, we realize that this is a lot of information. So everybody who has joined today, who has RSVP'd actually, will get a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation that Ashley and Esther are going to be giving. So that about sums up everything that I have. And I would now like to introduce to you Assemblyman Robert Rivas. He has represented California's 30th Assembly District since 2018 and currently serves as the chair of the Assembly of Agriculture Committee and the vice chair on the Latino Legislative Caucus. As a lifelong resident of the district, where he served 2 terms on the San Benito County Board of Supervisors, Rivas' childhood experiences, growing up in a farm working community, struggling to overcome a disability, gave him a direct understanding of the challenges faced by many of our community as they work hard to build better lives for themselves and their families. His legislative priorities include farm worker rights, climate resiliency, and sustainable and innovative agriculture, housing affordability and availability, and equitable access to education. Assemblymember Rivas lives in Hollister with his wife, Kristen, and their 5-year-old daughter, Melina. I now would like to give you Assemblyman Rivas.
Hey everyone, although I can't be there in person, I'm still glad to be joining the Gilroy and Morgan Hill Chambers of Commerce and California Consulting for this important virtual event. I'd like to thank Steve for inviting me to participate in this event. This virtual grant writing workshop is a timely event. It's timely because as our state continues to turn the corner and make progress on our most challenging year in recent history, our state legislature is focused on doing all we can to support California's economic recovery. Our recently passed state budget, a record-breaking state budget of $262.6 billion, demonstrates our commitment to helping all Californians and ensuring that our state emerges from this pandemic stronger than ever. Our state budget this year includes billions in immediate relief for families and small businesses. It includes an expansion of Medi-Cal, the state's health insurance program for the poor, and also includes a multi-billion-dollar investment over the next 2 years to tackle homelessness. As a former 2-term county supervisor, I am so thankful for the experience I had serving at the local level. And it's because of my 8 years as a county supervisor that I've had the opportunity to serve on the Assembly Committee for Local Government in my short time here in the state legislature. So I know how essential, how important our nonprofit and community organizations are, how important they are to our state, to local governments and to our communities. And look, nonprofits, our community organizations, they embody the best in our communities. They provide a way to bring people together. They foster civic engagement and leadership. They support local and regional economic growth. They work to serve others, to make a difference, and ultimately, they make our communities a better place for all. But I'm also well aware of the year-to-year fiscal challenges they face. Their ability to maintain reliable revenue sources and have an accurate or dependable budget is hard. It's very tough. And that can make long-term budgeting and program sustainability a real challenge. And clearly, financial assistance from federal, state, and local governments in the form of grants is critical. And that's exactly why I'm excited You've all made the time to attend this grant writing webinar. California Consulting has excellent resources and knowledge to set you and your organization on the right path to securing grants and having that much needed financial stability and those resources. I wish you all the best in this workshop and with your grant applications. I'd now like to introduce my friend, Brittany Sherman, CEO and President of the Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce. Brittany grew up in our region. She grew up in South San Jose and attended San Jose State University. And she has over 14 years of hospitality and sales experience. She's worked in places outside of California, such as Texas, North Carolina, Florida, as well as throughout our beautiful state here in California. Brittany began her career with the Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce in 2017 as the Member and Community Engagement Specialist. And in March 2020, became the CEO President. She currently has a staff of 2, herself included. And she has done so much to support the Morgan Hill business community throughout this pandemic by providing tireless communication, advocacy, and business visibility and support. We appreciate all you do, Brittany. Welcome.
All right, I think I'm up, right, Shasta?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I had some technical difficulties. I was going back between the live stream and forth, so I had a little extra. Sorry about that. Welcome, everyone. As Assemblymember Rivas said, can you hear that in the background? Okay, I think I covered it. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Okay, welcome. My name is Brittany Sherman. I'm the CEO President for the Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the Morgan Hill small and large business community and our area nonprofit organizations, I want to welcome you and thank you for attending the Grant Writing Workshop 101, not 401, Steve, 101. Submitting a successful grant is a very daunting process to many of our small businesses and nonprofits, but California Consulting has graciously donated their time and expertise to help make the process a little less painful for us all. This is a regional webinar supporting South County businesses in Morgan Hill and Gilroy and around. To that effect, it is also my pleasure to now introduce Mark Turner. Mark is the President CEO of the Gilroy Chamber of Commerce, and although he did not give me permission to say this, I'm going to say it anyways. He is the 2021 Chamber of Commerce CEO of the Year as awarded by the Western Association of Chamber Executives. Earlier this year, Mark assumed the role as chair of the Silicon Valley Chamber Coalition, which represents 18 chambers of commerce in and around Silicon Valley. The Chamber Coalition represents thousands of businesses throughout Santa Clara and Silicon Valley. Throughout the pandemic, Mark has been a wonderful mentor and someone that I've gone to for much advice. And we've also taken collective positions on many things that involve our South County businesses as a whole. So without further ado, Mark, I will go ahead and kick it to you.
Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate those kind words. Thank you so much. And thank you to California Consulting. And we're honored to be able to partner with them and with the Morgan Hill Chamber to bring you this webinar today. We hope that you'll find all that you need in order to better equip yourself as you prepare to write grants and are able to benefit your organization through this workshop today. So thank you all for participating. Certainly appreciate that. I would now like to introduce you to Steve Samuelian, who is the CEO of California Consulting. He's held various leadership posts during a career spanning over 38 years. Steve started California Consulting in 2004, which quickly established a good reputation for hard work and commitment to success for his clients. In California Consulting's 17 years of service, it has secured over 1,100 awarded grants totaling over $1.5 billion for its clients. I would now like to turn this over to Steve Steve, sorry, I knew I was gonna butcher your name, forgive me. Samuelian, Steve Samuelian.
Thank you so much, Mark. Very much appreciate it, the introduction. And I'll answer to anything, as I told Brittany earlier. So don't worry about my last name. You did great. I want to begin by thanking the Assemblyman. Assemblyman Rivas has been a tenacious leader in the legislature for his communities, cities, school districts, community-based organizations, nonprofits, for really all of his constituents. And he has been aggressive in his fight to bring funding into his assembly district. And I want to commend him. This today is yet another tangible, demonstrative step he's taken, bringing us all together to talk about grants, of how he wants to bring funding into his district. So thank you, Assemblymember Rivas. I also want to thank the Gilroy and Morgan Hill Chambers of Commerce. Mark and Brittany, thank you so much for organizing this. It's very evident why you have so many accolades and have won awards, and the various accolades you have. Very evident of the good work that you're doing. We have some team members from California Consulting that are on the Zoom. I'd like to just thank our Director of Communications, Shasta Bell, who helped organize this. Thank you, Shasta. Our Director of State Programs, Miriam DeLoza, is on. Miriam represents California Consulting in Sacramento. She meets with state agencies, keeping her finger on the pulse of funding. We also have Stephen Sanger, our Senior Associate for the Bay Area. He's based in Oakland. Stephen is with us, and Matthew Birmingham, who's one of our team members and associate with California Consulting as well. So welcome. Thank you to the team at California Consulting for being here with us. I don't want to give a long introduction, but just very briefly, as Mark said, we're the largest grant writing firm in the state. We've been in existence for 17 years. And as he stated, our grant writers have generated more than $1.5 billion in over 1,200 now competitive grant applications our team members have written that have been funded. Our team members include two of our grant experts who I'm very honored to introduce this afternoon, Ashley Ramsey and Esther Landon. We tease Ashley because she's our MIT graduate, and she has just been phenomenal with California Consulting, writing dozens and dozens of federal grants that have been awarded at the most competitive and highest levels. And we're very pleased to have Esther Landon joining Ashley this afternoon. Esther is one of our senior top team members and has been outstanding in a variety of different subject matters and disciplines, including workforce development, K-12, K-14, and many other areas. So Ashley and Esther are going to lead our presentation this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over to Esther at this time, and you're in very good hands with Esther and Ashley going through our Grants 101 presentation. So Esther, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, for that warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Esther Landon. I'm a project manager with California Consulting, and we're going to talk a little bit about Grants 101. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll start the presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Looks better. Okay, so we're basically going to talk about how to obtain grants from different sources for special projects. You know, everybody has, different needs, and so we want to be able to outline some different sources that you can find, different funding streams, and how to be able to pursue funding in order to be able to meet your goals. Now, how do you identify grant opportunities? Well, there's a variety of different sources that you can go to in order to be able to find different grant funds. But first, you really want to know what your focus is going to achieve. Is there a specific project that you want to do? Is there a specific goal or objectives that you're trying to achieve? And then from there, you can really kind of figure out what type of funding you're going to need. And once you are able to identify that focus, you can find different types of grant funding just about everywhere. Thankfully, there's a variety of different funding sources and areas in order to be able to find different types of grant funding. There's federal grants, there's state grants, there's local grants, there's foundations, development offices, there's economic development funds that are out there. And so you really want to be able to take the time to figure out what you want to do and what type of source would be best to be able to fund that particular project. Now, one of the main sources that everybody kind of tends to go to in the grants world, in particular for federal grants, is grants.gov. Grants.gov has a variety of different grants from all of the federal departments, so including Department of Education, Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, for example. And so you need to create a login. It's free to use the website. And once you've created a login, you can actually go through and search for different types of grants, depending on what your project focus is going to be. You can also filter the different searches depending on what it is that you want. Put in keywords if you're a nonprofit organization and you want something that's specific for a nonprofit. It'll outline the different eligibility criteria along the side, and you can kind of toggle the different eligibility criteria. So you're not having to go through this huge list of grants. It'll narrow it down for you so you can narrow your search. Now, the state of California has its own grant website. It's the grants.ca.gov, and it's a bit easier to use than grants.gov. It doesn't have as many grant opportunities as, say, grants.gov does, because grants.gov is federal. But if you're a California entity, you can find grant opportunities here in the California grants portal here. Again, it has some drop-down menus where all you have to do is put in what applicant type you are, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a business, if you're a public agency, what type of grant category you're looking for, if it's public works, if it's education, etc. And it'll show you a comprehensive list, and that list is maintained by the state. Now, there are other ways to find grants besides grants.gov and the California State's portal. You can look at agency websites directly. There are some even private companies that have foundations where they like to do philanthropic work. And so if you have some large corporations in your area, you want to see if maybe they have some philanthropic goals that maybe align with the goals of your organization. You can look at their foundation websites. You can just do a random Google search. Sometimes that comes up. You strike gold sometimes if you just do a random Google search. Philanthropy Today is another really good source to be able to find some of those philanthropic funds that are available through not only those foundations, but lots of other different organizations. You can also get on our mailing list. We send out a pretty comprehensive list on I believe it's a monthly basis that includes municipal grants, education grants, and it's a very comprehensive list. You can access it on our website. It gets posted, but we do send it out in our regular newsletter that goes out to all of our clients and potential clients. You can also take a look again at websites for businesses in your area, like I said, to see if they have some philanthropic goals that align with what you're doing. And you'll be surprised, a lot of businesses that you wouldn't think have foundations or do grant making do that. And so you'll be able to find different types of funding everywhere. There's also another website that's not on here, but I'll mention it. It's called California Grants Watch. It's another really good website that I've used with clients in order to be able to identify a variety of different funding opportunities for nonprofits, for education, for different types of organizations, for businesses. There's a lot of funding out there right now. The state budget was just passed, and so there's a lot of funding that's coming down the pipeline through the state as well as through the federal government. And so there's going to be a lot of funding available. So this is a really good time to start talking about what your needs are and what types of funding you want to be able to identify in order to meet those needs. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Esther. Now we're going to go over, now you've identified a grant, you've identified that it works with you. So we are going to take it from here and say, how do you actually write that grant? First, we are going to do a quick overview of the full process. So we talked about identifying our needs and focus, finding prospective grants, check, right? Now we need to develop our general proposal and budget for the grant. So that means what to be doing in the grant. So everything that you say you need to do, you're going to do when you write a proposal, you actually need to be able to do. So keep in mind the actual performance of the grant when you are writing your proposal. So only if we can actually perform. You know, what I have found is that in grants, they want you to be extremely they will appreciate your honesty in identifying a true scope of work for your project and a realistic budget. So that means something that is going to I'm sorry, I see that I'm breaking up and I'm trying to kind of play my slow internet connection. It was doing totally fine until it was my turn. You want to make something that's realistic. So don't make it so small. So make sure you give yourself a little bit of a pad so that you can perform it with the money that is being given. But don't make, so try to find that's what you're going to do. You don't have to have the final version, proposal and budget before you even start writing. And some of that is going to change as you do prepare the proposal.
Ashley, this is Steve.
In between here in this dotted area as a letter of inquiry, it sometimes, in some circumstances, those are required. If I'm in order to be considered for your application,
Ashley,
if you find the,
this is Steve. I think we're having some problems.
Steve, I can't hear you, but I mean, I can.
Okay, we're gonna switch. Esther, if you can jump in, because we're getting a lot of comments that we're not able to hear Ashley, it sounds like. Esther, is there a way you could jump in?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, you're coming in really clear.
Back up.
Yeah, Esther, you're coming in very clearly. So.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Esther.
I'm back in. All right. Let me pull
awesome.
up my presentation.
And we can, Ashley can maybe try a little bit later and see if her connection is more stable.
More stable. Okay, sounds good. Well, what Ashley was trying to talk about here, everyone, was, once you've identified, what your focus is, then the grant writing process then kind of begins. So identifying what your focus is going to be is basically step one. The next step is, once you've identified the funding opportunities, then you got to start doing the work in order to be able to figure how do we get the funds? What information do we need in order to put into the grant application to be able to apply and make sure that we're eligible? So one of the biggest parts of a grant proposal is the budget. How much funding do you really need? How much funding do you have to leverage? Because there are some grants that do require match funding, whether it's cash or in kind. So that's something that you have to also consider is, how do we have that? also may be required to submit a letter of inquiry as opposed to a formal grant application. And so the difference between a letter of inquiry and a formal grant application is that a letter of inquiry is usually maybe 1, 2, 3 pages at the most, where you kind of outline your idea to say, hey, you know, if we had this funding, this is what we would like to do with it. You submit the letter of inquiry, and then if the foundation or the organization who's doing the grant making likes your idea, then they invite you to apply. So you have to make sure that they're not asking for a letter of inquiry as opposed to a formal application. But usually a letter of inquiry will lead to an application. So once you are applying, then you have to prepare your proposal. Of course, you want to make sure you get it in before the deadline. You may need letters of support also with your application. So you already want to identify, you know, either partners or if you're submitting an application with you know, as a consortium kind of thing, you may need some letters. You may need MOUs that are already in place. So for example, there are some grant awards out there to serve formerly incarcerated populations. Sometimes they require that you have an MOU with your local county jail or with a state prison, for example. So you have to check to see, you know, is it something that I'm going to need? Do I need a formal MOU? Do I need a letter of commitment? Do I need a letter of support? And those 3 things are very different from each other. And it requires the time to be able to reach out, get the letters, collect everything. So you want to make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to be able to do that. So aside from your letters of inquiry, your letters of support, your MOUs, your budget, you also want to make sure that you can collect any data that might be needed as well. So you put everything together, you submit it by the deadline, you're awarded, you know, congratulations, you've gotten the money. Then you implement the project, and then of course there's always the reporting piece. So you always have to be prepared to do reporting. It's usually fiscal reporting, and it is some type of narrative reporting. Sometimes they're separate, sometimes they're combined in one report. Sometimes the reports are at the end of the project. Other times the reporting is on a quarterly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis. Some of the shorter projects can be on a monthly basis. So you want to make sure that you also have the capacity and that you've identified who's going to do the reporting and how often. Now, in order to be able to apply for some of the funding that is available out there, you want to make sure that you have that you're set up in all the required portals. And so oftentimes, so for example, like grants.gov, for example, requires not only that you have a login, but that you have a DUNS number. You need to make sure you have your employer identification number. You have to be registered in SAMS. And so if you're not registered, you don't have those registrations completed, you got to make sure that you get those done. And sometimes those can also be time consuming as well. They can take a couple of weeks in order to be able to get the confirmation back that your registration is complete and assigned your number. You also have to make sure that if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, that you have a copy of your letter available. If you don't, make sure you get one from the IRS because oftentimes you will have to submit that with your application as well. So as you write the proposal, you know, in addition to all of those things that you have to prepare, as you're writing it, you want to know who your audience is. You know, who's going to be reading this? Is it for the Department of Education? Is it for the Department of Labor? Is it for the Department of Agriculture? What are the goals and the outcomes of this grant? And then you can tailor your writing to make sure that you're touching upon all the key points and the guidelines. Read summaries of previously awarded grants. Sometimes you can access what's been awarded before. If it's a grant that comes out on a regular basis every year, every 2 years, every 5 years, you can oftentimes find information about, you know, previous awards, who was awarded. I've even found Google searches where you can actually find some of the applications that were submitted, you know, so you can see what other people have written and how they were awarded. You want to keep your narratives concise but persuasive. Some narratives can be quite long, especially some of those federal grants. They can be 55 pages long. And so you really want to be able to, you know, fill up as much space as possible. You definitely want to be organized, especially if you're writing something that's a 55 pager. You know, oftentimes those federal grants come with a checklist already within the application package, so it can kind of help you follow along. If it doesn't come with the checklist, we highly recommend that you create a checklist. So that way you know that you've got everything that the application is requiring of you. So like, for example, your letters of support, your 501c3 letter, you've got your budget taken care of, and et cetera, et cetera. And then if you have to get things signed, make sure that you leave enough time before the deadline in order to be able to get those signatures. There are some times where grants do require wet signatures as opposed to, you know, digital signatures. So you want to make sure that if you are required to get, you know, a CEO signature or, you know, your business office's signature, that you leave yourself enough time to be able to get those signatures so that you can submit it. And we already talked a little bit about this, you know, preparing for the, you know, the end in mind. So, you know, start with the end. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What metrics it is that you're trying to meet? And then, you know, kind of figure out, okay, this is what we want to do. How are we going to accomplish this? And then you kind of fit the funding in to be able to do that. And then again, you make sure that you keep in mind also, you know, the reporting and the post-award compliance expectations, you know, the reporting, who's going to do the reporting, how often is the reporting going to be done, and also incorporate that into your management plan as part of your proposal. And whether you're awarded or not for a grant, it's a really good practice to request feedback. So you want to know what parts of your application were particularly strong and what parts of your application were not as strong. Because if you're going to be pursuing multiple grants from different sources, you want to be able to write the strongest application possible. So getting some feedback is always a really good best practice, and you'll be in one proposal and in couple of different proposals, but you'll get different types of feedback. So knowing your audience is really important. Award follow-up is I touched upon this already a little bit, where we talk about you know, post-awarding reporting, know when and how the reporting is supposed to be done. Some grants require a template, so they'll provide you with a template. Usually all of that information is outlined in the award contract, so make sure you understand your award contract very clearly so you know what to report and when to report it. And then of course, if you're not sure, make sure that you reach out and ask those questions, you know, if you need some assistance. Grants are always open. The grant makers are always open to questions. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out. They always have somebody that you can contact that will answer your questions. And so perform administration as you go. So in other words, as you're implementing your project, you know, you want to be able to collect the data and collect information on all of the different grant activities that you're performing. Taking pictures or making videos is also a really great way of capturing some of that information, keeping track of success stories, making sure that you're keeping track of expenditures separately from all of your other funds, especially if you have multiple funding sources, because on those grant funds. And then you also want to report, sometimes they want you to report on what you have leveraged as well. So you want to be able to keep track of all of that. And then of course, if there's any invoices that need to be sent out, you got to make sure that you keep those invoices separate from everything else.
Esther, this is Steve. I'm going to jump in real quick, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So on the post-award compliance and the follow-up, I just want to make a point. You know, over the last 17 years, we've seen a lot with the company, and we're constantly learning. One of the things that's happening the last year, maybe I'd say 12 to 18 months, is we get calls from cities, school districts, nonprofits, colleges, all of the above. And they say, you know, you're not our consultant. We're not your client. We wrote this grant in-house and it got awarded. And it's large federal grant or large state grant. We're 3 months or 4 months or 6 months through the post-award compliance and reporting. Is there any way we can hand this off to you? and they say, we know you didn't write it, but we just had no idea that the reporting and administration and grant management was going to be so cumbersome and extensive. Is there any way we can hand it off? And we say, sure, yeah, absolutely. We're happy to do it. But what we try to do, and we do more than try, we do it, is before the agency applies for the grant, we sit down and go through the post-award compliance with them, with you, and say, look, if you get this $500,000 or you get this $700,000 or $1 million, here's what you're going to have to do for the next 24 months, or here's what you're going to have to do for the next 36 months. So if you can do that, great, let's apply. But if you can't, let's not apply, or be prepared to hire someone who's going to come in as a third party and do the post-award compliance reporting and administration for you. So that's a threshold question up front before we begin our applications, is we go over in detail the post-award compliance. And then as Ashley mentioned and Esther mentioned, the other thing we do at the beginning is go through the scoring rubric, make sure the entity is actually eligible. We do what we call a go, no go analysis. Is this project that you would like to get funded, does it fit the scoring rubric for this application? It may be a great project, but it might not fit the scoring rubric and it might not fit the criteria. And so, you know, people are sometimes surprised when I tell them this, but we turn down clients, but we turn them down for a good reason. We turn them down because their projects don't fit the application that they want to pursue. And we say, you know what?
Yeah.
This one doesn't work. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I was just gonna just connect, Steve, that our process is certainly something that is a best practice that you would want to adopt for your internal grant writing as well. So whether you are going to go out to a consultant to write a huge federal grant, or if you're writing a local small grant that you feel like you'd like to write on your own, that go or no go analysis about whether, am I eligible? Am I meeting the purpose of the grant? Am I going to be able to perform the post-award compliance? That is something that is really, after you've identified your purpose for your project, that's really the next step. So you've got your purpose, you find your grants, and then you have to figure out, am I going to write it or am I not going to write it? It will save you a lot of time and heartache from getting deep into a grant and spending a lot of time developing it, and then finding out, you know, while you're halfway developed, that you really are kind of stretching that link. You want to try to find the closest nexus as you can to the purpose and intent of your project and the purpose and intent of the grant, which will be found in its guidelines. I'm sorry, you kind of ran off with that, Steve. Yeah, I can turn back to you now, back to post-award compliance if you like.
No, Ashley, that was great. And you're coming in very clearly, by the way. So I think just continue with some of your best practices. I know you have a lot of advice.
Oh yeah, Esther, you did a fantastic. I'm sorry, Steve.
No, you're good. You're coming in clearly, Ashley. So I'm happy about that. We can hear you very clearly now.
Let me go back to just a couple of things that I had wanted to add. Esther got most of them and did a fantastic job. Thank you so much, Esther, for covering during my technical problem there.
No problem.
So way back when we talked about federal grants, now, of course, you may not be interested in federal grants, but if you are, we talked about SAM's, DUNS, and the EIN. All of those are free to obtain. So I think Esther may have mentioned that, and she definitely mentioned the proper time frame. It can take several weeks to get each of those, and they actually have to be done sequentially. So I always recommend for my my nonprofit clients, and even those when I talk on these kinds of webinars, is get grant ready now. and then maintain that grant readiness, because sometimes with some agencies, whether they're federal or state, you may find a grant with only 2 weeks to prepare your application. And if you're not ready with a DUNS number or a SAM registration, then you're not getting that grant. And so I would recommend that you go ahead and start right now. Look for your DUNS number. It's Duns and Bradstreet. They issue a specific number for each organization, actually for each account that the federal government might make a deposit to. If you don't have a DUNS number, there is a place on the Duns and Bradstreet website, which is dandb.com, where you can request your DUNS number. If you are unable to do this, you certainly don't have to pay for anything to be done. But if it is overwhelming, you can seek a grant writing professional like us at California Consulting, and we can help you become grant ready that way too. But you can do it yourself, and it is free. The SAM especially has had a lot of people who try to scam people and say, oh, for $100, we'll get your SAM registration, and it just costs $100 for a SAM registration. SAM registrations are free. They can sometimes be confusing, but there is help available. But leave yourself time, get that grant ready now. DUNS numbers are issued 1 and you're done. EIN 1 and you're done through the IRS if you don't already have one of those. If you have a 501c3, obviously you already have an EIN, but some people on this, some people have very new organizations, and some people are in established organizations. So I want to hit all the different levels. For your SAM registration, not only do you have to establish your SAM registration, but you have to update it once a year. And so that will be confirming your contact information and your account information. No, it's a little bit scary, but there is probably the top level of security available for data through the federal government on the SAM account information. So you will have to have that in order to be granted any funding of any kind, whether that's a grant or a cooperative agreement or a procurement contract. If you're doing business with the federal government, you've got to have that SAM. And in order to have the SAM, you got to have it done. I think I've probably talked your ear off on that. So moving on to my next best practice I wanted to just touch base on is Esther had talked about reaching out to companies that are near you. That is actually a really phenomenal way to get funding. And like she mentioned, it can come from really surprising places. Like you may not think that, you know, a local shop or industry has a philanthropy section, but I would look at their website first, and then if you don't find it, maybe give a call to their community relations department. And there's a lot of opportunity locally that doesn't get turned up very well. And I would even go so far as to say, if you serve a lot of people who work for a certain entity that maybe isn't within your town, maybe these people all commute a long way, but they are all working for the same organization. A lot of the philanthropic branches of certain corporations really love to make an impact on the places where their employees work and live. So, I mean, obviously where they work, that's based, you know, usually in the location where the corporation is or the company's site, but where they live also makes an impact. So let's say you're maybe a theater group and you do a summer camp for kids, and you just happen to notice that a lot of your parents work 3 towns over at one particular company. That company may be interested in helping you fund a scholarship program for your theater program, so for your summer camp, because that helps improve the quality of life for their employees. And then I want to switch over to know your audience. And this is kind of tangential to what we're talking about. So these businesses, you know, if you know that their employees work for you, you know that they're going to care about what their employees care about keeping and maintaining these employees through improving their quality of life. Well, you also need to know your audience when you're doing something. Let's say you are an organization and you've got a great new technology that you want to develop. There are fantastic opportunities for small businesses to pair with universities or to do some kind of some research into their own technologies without a university through various, especially federal government, through the SBIR, Small Business Innovation and Research and the STTR programs that have to come out of every agency with a minimum budget of, I can't remember what it was, maybe 15 million, no, billion. But anyway, the SBI or STTR programs, for example, are decided by experts in your field. So you may only get 20 pages for your narrative, but in that narrative, you don't have to explain this to somebody who's just a volunteer that is not an expert. You can go ahead and jump right into the technical language. Whereas if you are writing to a general foundation that is interested in technology, you need to give a lot more background and get everybody onto the same page as you first. So that's one of the key things that I wanted to point out about knowing your audience, is knowing, like, can I use my terms of art, or do I need to make this understandable to almost anybody who's going to read it? So, you know, a lot of times actually fire grants for like defensible space or volunteer fire departments, a lot of the time those are evaluated by experts in the fire field. But if you go into, let's say if you're writing to Lowe's about a community project, there you're going to have to start from scratch. Not that they wouldn't understand what you're doing, just that you want to make sure that there's no question about what you're saying. You want to give the background that's necessary to convey your message. And a lot of the times, oh, go ahead.
And yeah, just real quick, sorry to interrupt, Ashley. Just generally, you know, kind of 30,000 foot view, there's federal grants, there's state grants, and then there's private foundation grants. We write a lot of federal and state grants. So we write a lot of U.S. Department of Justice and, you know, Cal EPA and US EPA and Cal Fire, Caltrans. Gosh, we write the heck out of Caltrans grants, right, Esther and Ashley? So we tend to write a lot of federal and state, but there's all these other grants, corporate foundation grants that are out there, Honda Foundation and Walmart Foundation and Target Foundation. And generally the way I think of them, I have more of a simplistic way to think of it than, you know, experts like Ashley and Esther. I think of them as the federal grants are super competitive. You're competing nationwide, high dollar amounts, but very competitive. The state grants in California are also very competitive. They're also pretty large applications, usually not as competitive as the federal grants, but also, you know, competitive and higher dollar amounts. And then the private foundation grants, generally speaking, there's exceptions, are smaller. They're generally the $10,000, $25,000, $50,000, you know, $100,000 grants. And you should have a relationship or know someone usually with the foundation, or have that foundation or corporation, like Ashley mentioned, Lowe's, in your community. So if you're applying to Lowe's, you should probably have a Lowe's department store in your community where you're located, where you're applying from, where your organization is based. If you're applying for Home Depot, same thing. I remember in the Walmart, I don't know if it's still like this, Ashley and Esther, but I remember Walmart, I think they actually had a requirement that you have to go talk to your local Walmart store manager. And make sure that
that's true. Even Starbucks has a foundation as well where they require that, where you have to be connected to your local Starbucks store manager as part of the grant requirements.
Yes. And I saw a lot of questions on the chat about Sam's and Dunn's. Again, I'll give my simple way to think of it. Sam's and Dunn's are registration mechanisms for federal grants. So if you're not applying for federal grants, you basically don't have to worry about Sam's or Dunn's. I saw someone write, we only apply for small foundation grants. Do we need to worry about Sam's and Dunn's? I don't think that you do. Esther and Ashley can correct me, but I don't believe if you're only applying for small foundation grants, you don't have to worry about grants.gov and Sam's and Dunn's and all that. So Sam's and Dunn's are registration mechanisms for the federal grants through grants.gov. And then there's also now Just Grants, which is a new program that just came out also for federal law enforcement grants that
through the Department of Justice, I believe. That's
Department of Justice grants. So there's all kinds of things. I mean, we're just scratching the surface. We're just doing grants 101. We're just kind of scratching the surface, but we write, you know, 80% of what we write, maybe 85% of what we write at California Consulting with our 28 team members, 80% or more of what we write are federal and state grants. And so for those grants, then yes, grants.gov, Dunn's, Sam's, Just Grants for DOJ are very important. So that's what I wanted to interject. Hopefully that answered a few of the questions. I see a lot of questions in the chat room. That's great. Keep the questions coming. Ashley, you want to continue?
Yes, I'll go ahead and give some more best practices that I found.
You're breaking up again, Ashley.
Yeah, you're breaking up again, Ashley.
Okay, so we went over audience. Oh.
Although I do.
That's a bummer. Let me see if I can.
Esther, do you want to jump in while Ashley's straightening that out?
I do. On the talking about the DUNS number and SAM's registration, I would highly recommend that your organization considers applying and registering for a DUNS number and the SAMS.gov registration anyway, because even some state grants and local grants, sometimes they ask you if you have a DUNS number on the application, even if it's not a federal grant. Sometimes they'll ask you if you have one. It's not necessarily a deal breaker whether or not you have one, but it's always kind of nice to show that, you know, you have a DUNS number. And it's great to have that option because there is a lot of funding that's coming down both at the federal and state level. And so if your organization hasn't considered or has never applied for any federal funding, you know, maybe this is the time to start considering it because there is quite a bit of funding coming out from all of the major departments from the federal side. So I would recommend it. Like we said, it's free. It's good to have and not need it. And rather than, you know, oh, there's this grant coming up and I don't have my DUNS number and now I can't apply for it. So that's my recommendation.
And I echo Esther's recommendation. And I would also add that there are also, there's the federal money kind of gets sneaky sometimes. It finds its way into different funding levels that you would never expect. So we've talked a lot about federal and state, but also some of your local agencies like your COG, your MPO, your air quality management district, all of them have options for you. All of them have opportunities for you to get some kinds of funding. Some of that funding filters down through the federal government, and under some circumstances, you will need to have a DUNS number to receive that funding, whether it's actually directly from the federal government or not. Now, if you're only seeking private funding, it's not very likely that you're going to run into federal funding that you would need a DUNS number for. But when you go to your air quality management district and you want your electric lawn maintenance equipment, or you need some transit vehicles, if you don't have that DUNS, your pot of money is much more limited. So I would go ahead and get that DUNS.
Ashley, I'll jump in. I saw a question regarding where to locate private foundation dollars. We use Foundation Directory. It's a really good source of information for foundations. We've used it for many years. We highly recommend it, and you know, we've used them all, so our grant writers tend to like Foundation Directory. So I hope that answers your question about that. I also saw a question about what types of grants, you know, we bring in. There's all types. I mean, everything from Caltrans grants for bridges and roads and streets to grants for at-risk youth counseling. Esther's been great in the workforce development area with job training programs for youth and college students and even formerly incarcerated individuals. Esther's been great in that area, among other areas. So, you know, when we look at the over 1,200 grants we've written that have been awarded, they're across the board. They're for 3 new fire trucks for one city and a new police motorcycle for another city and 9 new CNG buses for a school district. So it's really across the board. That 1.5 or 1.6 billion we brought in is really across a whole myriad of different disciplines and a variety of different topics. I don't know, Ashley, if you want to add anything to that, but those are it's really a broad answer. So it's difficult to say, you know, well, all the grant funding is available for only this subject. And I want to also, before I turn it over to Ashley again, Esther made a great point. We're seeing more funding available in 2021 than we've ever seen. There's more grant funding available at the federal and state level than we've ever seen. I don't know if that's because of the pandemic or because of everyone's excited about grants right now, or what the reason is, but both the state budget and federal budget, there's a lot of money available for grants right now.
Steve, I had a couple questions. Is it okay if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you. You talked quite a bit about kind of being prepared and allowing enough time to submit a full grant application. What is your best practice as far as when should you start that process of looking for a grant, putting things together? Is it like a 3 or a 4 week timeline, a 3-month timeline? What's your best suggestion for that?
It depends on the grant. I mean, if it's a 100-page, 150-page federal grant, then it won't be 2 or 3 weeks. Ashley or Esther, do you want to address Brittany's question with more specificity?
Yeah, I think if you consider the project development portion of it, which is so vital, if you already have a project ready to go and a grant comes up that's super well suited to you, I would say maybe 3 weeks might be good as far as preparing to submit the grant. And then for a private foundation grant, then if you actually, like if you were doing a federal grant, I typically, now it really seriously depends on the grant itself and the complexities of the grant and the project, but I usually spend between, I would say probably 6 weeks and 3 months preparing a project and a grant under ideal situations. And in some circumstances, I mentioned some of those technology projects. There are some people that are spending a year preparing to submit their application because of the technicalities involved in some of those more scientific and technological advancement grants that are, and you can even be a for-profit in some of these instances and apply. But you want to also, if you are a for-profit, make sure that if you're receiving funding, it doesn't prevent you from making a profit, or if it does, that you're prepared to make that accommodation. So that was just a little aside. And then the other guidance I would say on figuring out how much time on your grant is to think about also how long it will take to award. And you probably don't know this because this is Grants 101, but a private foundation is probably going to take anywhere from 1 to 6 months. The state is probably going to take 3 to 6 months, and most federal agencies are going to be more like 5 to 9 months, sometimes even close to a year. And if you happen to work for my favorite agency, FEMA, it can be 2 years. Okay, but it's like a back and forth. You're not just sitting there waiting to hear back. But we also are getting $20 million from FEMA, so it's something you might be willing to wait 2 years for.
Sure.
So
And yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you. Do you, in your experience, do you see people having a project and trying to find a grant that matches it, or looking for the grant and developing the project to match with it?
It can go either way, and actually both are really successful. So I would say it's more, you're very likely to win if you already have a project and it matches perfectly with the grant. If you already have a project and you find a grant that's really close and you're willing to make those adjustments, and that's the big part. Are you willing to make the adjustments that you need to be competitive for the grant based on a scoring rubric, based on the purpose of the grant? So is it still going to meet your needs? Are you able to make those adjustments that meet the purpose of the grant? In that case, I think it would be fine to make those small adjustments. Some people say, oh, here, I kind of have an interest in this one very broad topic, and here's a grant that wants something done in this very broad topic. Grants typically have a fairly narrow set of purposes though. So as long as you want to fit that purpose, you can go ahead and bring a project. So let's say you wanted to do an after-school program and you find a grant that wants to fund after-school programs, but the after-school program is very specific to maybe people with a single mother or a single parent rather, that are immigrants and impoverished. So you would have to say, do I have enough of this population to serve? How am I going to reach this population and serve them? Can I provide the services that are needed to meet their needs, and do those align with the grant? So those are a lot of questions, but that would be kind of how you would take the approach if you find a grant and then develop something to apply for it. You can really do either way. But but I kind of mentioned the authenticity earlier. So you want to make sure that you're not only pursuing something just to get money. There has to be that alignment and purpose.
Great, thank you.
Ashley, I want to jump in on something you said about disadvantaged or impoverished communities. So a question we get a lot, I get a lot, and I think other members of our team do too, is can you only apply for a grant if you have a high level of poverty or high level of unemployment or, you know, disadvantaged DAC, right? Disadvantaged community designation or status. I'm sure many of you on this call have heard of DAC. And the answer I give, and I think Ashley would concur and Esther would concur, is it's usually helpful, especially if it's called out in the scoring rubric that you get extra points for being below the median household income average or being at a certain poverty level. It's actually called out that you get an extra 5 points or 3 points or, you know, whatever. It's helpful, but in many cases, it doesn't exclude you. There are some grants where we just, as I said earlier, we look at them, we look at the client, we look at the project, we say, you shouldn't apply for this. But many times, don't be completely discouraged, especially before looking at the scoring rubric. Do the examination, you know, look at the empirical data. We get school districts, for example, that approach us that say, gosh, we're in the Bay Area or we're in Orange County or we're in a certain part of LA County. We're very affluent. We have a 8% or 6% free and reduced lunch number. We're probably not eligible for grants. Well, they are eligible for grants. They're not as eligible as a district that has a 91% or 98% free and reduced lunch number. It's going to limit what we can apply for, but they're still eligible for many grants. So kind of a give and take. It's not clear cut. It's not black and white where, you know, you're in or you're out. It really is a case by case kind of analysis. So Ashley, you want to add anything to that? Because I get asked that question a lot about, you know, well, we're an affluent district or we're an affluent community. We must not be eligible for anything, right?
Yeah, Steve, you're right. It's definitely on a case-by-case basis for the grant. So in the nonprofit space, obviously there is a lot that really does want to dive down and help people who are disadvantaged in some way or another. But that's not a necessity in certain, you know, in other grants. So it's going to be spelled out in the purpose of the grant. And typically with the foundation grants, it will be spelled out pretty early in their purpose. How that, you know, they'll indicate that they want to impact people that typically are excluded or people that are impoverished, or, you know, it will be clear in their purpose if it is a
Yeah, you cut out a little, Ashley, but exactly. I mean, you just have to read the guidelines. We read the guidelines, and if the guidelines say only school districts with, you know, 80% or higher free and reduced lunch are going to get an extra 10 points, well, we don't encourage our school district clients that have a 10% free and reduced lunch to apply for that grant. It's just, you know, very, very common sense. We look at the guidelines and examine the guidelines and then determine it from there. But there's definitely grants, as I think I heard Ashley say, there's definitely grants where there's an advantage to a high poverty level. There's an advantage to a disadvantaged community status. So.
Steve, we have somebody in the chat that was asking about what about GuideStar to evaluate an organization?
Ashley, I'm not familiar with GuideStar. Are you familiar with GuideStar?
I'm so sorry about all these technical problems. Yes, GuideStar is an excellent opportunity for that evaluation of your organization to take place. And it triggers, you know, private donors for direct donations to know that your organization is a good steward of the donated funds, that you are a good member of the community. So I do recommend that people get involved with GuideStar, get certified through GuideStar. And that way that you can be opened up for public dollars. And through that process, you'll also encounter a lot of the same questions that you're going to encounter in the grant writing process. So just like GuideStar is determining that you know, you use good accounting processes, that you have good policy making processes and quality control processes that help make sure that you're reaching the population you're trying to reach. The grants are going to want to know that too. So we spent a lot of time on post-award compliance. And I feel like probably in the 101 area of grant writing that this is kind of a head scratcher. But the great thing about, like, if you've been awarded a grant and you have performed it well, it makes you more interesting to get other grants. So as you win a grant and you perform within your budget, you perform within your timeline, and you make the impacts that you wanted to make, and you report those on time. Now you have someone to say, hey, they're a great agency to give an award to because they're going to be a good steward of these funds. They're going to do what they said. And you, that is typically referred to as your grant capacity. So as you win a grant, as you perform the grant, you become more eligible for more grants. So kind of like when you get into the employment area, you don't have any experience. As you gain experience, you become more marketable. Same thing for grants. So where did we come up? I totally lost where we started. I'm sorry.
We started with GuideStar.
Oh yes, yeah, GuideStar's the same thing. So in this case, if you don't have any grant experience, but you've been through GuideStar, you've gotten certified on GuideStar, you've received some private donations through the GuideStar networks, you can go to that. So let's say you haven't received a grant, but you have an application that says, what other grants have you been awarded? Well, your answer is, I haven't been awarded any other grants, but I received private donations through GuideStar. And here's how we make sure that we take care of those funds. Here's how we do accounting to make sure that our donations are taken care of. Whether it's GuideStar or not, you can take your actual experiences, your actual processes, and use them to explain how you are going to be a good recipient of these funds. So you're going to hit the targets, you're going to be accountable, you've got good financial tracking practices. And let me just clarify that a little as well. We talked about tracking all of our finances separately. You don't have to get all fancy, get a whole separate QuickBooks or a whole nother system to track your grants in a different account. You just have to be able to, you know, say, here's our receipts from this particular grant. We didn't mix this funding together. Or maybe you have an Excel spreadsheet, or even if you're super old school, but please be organized if you do this, paper, you know, like just something where you have a clear accounting of how you ran this program. What did the program cost? How did you use the grant funds? And we also talked, I think Esther went over the slide about your portion. So there's a match in a lot of grants. In some of those grants, that match can be met by in-kind donations or volunteer time. So if you have elected to use your match, to meet your match using volunteer time, you want to make sure you use sign-in sheets for your volunteers while they're working, their names and their hours. So you can say, yes, we really did have these volunteers. We really did put in the amount of work that we thought we were going to do. And so we were able to meet the match. So let's say that you have you've got a little league, and you guys got a Major League Baseball grant to renovate one of your fields, and you your parent association was going to be maybe demolishing your existing dugouts, and you thought in the application, you thought that that was going to take 10 people 8 hours, and you put a number there that's associated with the time of those 10 people that worked 8 hours. So now when the grants, you're actually doing the grant, and maybe only 5 people show up, is that okay? Yeah, it probably is, but does it really take them now 16 hours each instead of 8 hours each? Even if there's some small variation, it's gonna be fine. But if you don't make the match, you may have to come up with the difference. So you also want to, in that budget, we talked about being realistic. We talked about adding a little buffer. You want to make sure, if you are counting on in-kind volunteer time, that if you cannot get for sure that number of people, that you're estimating, that you kind of have an idea of where you might come up with the additional cash or other sources of volunteer time. So maybe they didn't help, maybe you didn't use all the time to demolish the dugouts, but maybe you just convert that that volunteer time into your opening day ceremony preparations. So maybe you had some extra volunteers, maybe they didn't want to get out and demolish the dugout, but they're happy to do promo and decorations and hosting for that event, and that would be totally fine. You just document how it was, you just include it in your reports to Major League Baseball when you give those, and reach out to them also. Like if you find that this is about to happen, you can certainly come in and say, hey, I think that we didn't get enough people in our dugouts, but we have extra people on our promotions. Is it okay if we swap those? And so that's where having that relationship with your contact for the grant agency, whether it's Major League Baseball or Lowe's or the Parks Department or your AQMD, anyone, you know, that contact is there to help you. They also want to get that money out. They want to get that money spent for the purpose it was allocated. So you're all on the same page, you're a team. I see a hand up, and I am going to allow Yolanda to talk. Except that you might be muted. Yolanda, did you have a question? Okay. I'm going to switch now, unless Steve, did you have something else? I'm going to touch base in the question and answer.
Yes, just wanted to jump in, Ashley, on a couple of things and add. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but that's okay. Sometimes when we jump around, it's a free-flowing conversation and a lot of dialogue. And I've also been trying to monitor the questions in the chat box, and there's a lot of great, lively conversation and questions. It's awesome. I want to mention an issue or relay a story. Danielle from our team, previously of our team, who worked closely with Ashley, she wrote a grant several years ago over in Monterey County. It was 24 nonprofits were involved in the grant, and I believe it was either 7 or 8 cities. And the grant required that each of those entities meet together one time a month, have a sign-in sheet. Ashley just mentioned a sign-in sheet. Have a sign-in sheet. Have an agenda for the meeting. Have written minutes from the meeting. And Danielle traveled a couple-hour drive and went over to Monterey County every month for this meeting. And one month she was in the meeting and she had gotten to know pretty much everybody that attended every month. And there was one individual there she didn't know. And she asked who she was, and she was from the agency that administered and gave out the grant funding. And she was there just to watch. She was there just to monitor. I'd never seen that before. I don't know, Ashley, if you've ever seen that before. She didn't call ahead of time. She didn't ask about the meeting, you know, when it was, where it was. She just knew they were meeting, you know, third Thursday of the month, 1 o'clock, this location. She showed up. So the agencies do follow up. And they do take they do take
to scare you away. It's just to prepare you.
Yeah, they do take it seriously, and as well they should. They're dealing with tax dollars. And so as long as every T is crossed and every I is dotted on your reporting, which is, you know, we take it very seriously too, then you're fine. But that's just the first time that it ever happened to us, and kind of an interesting story, Ashley.
Yeah, that is an interesting story. And I'm actually, the beginning of it reminded me of something I wanted to bring up here, and that is partnerships. We didn't add that on the slides, and I think I need to certainly put a slide in about that. But, you know, we often think about applying for grants, and everybody seems to want to be the applicant, which is great, you know, but I would not discount the opportunity to partner with other NPOs in your community, or even with your city or your county or your chamber, or, you know, there's so many opportunities for partnership. And we've just come off of a long trend, and I don't know that it's really ending, a trend of public-private partnerships. So you're the private in that partnership that people didn't think would happen. But it happens frequently, actually, and there's a lot of success in it. So one thing that comes to mind would be our EDA grants, Economic Development
Administration.
Administration, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like, what's the A? It's administration. Okay. They
You've
have
written
some
it. You've written
fantastic.
them. Yeah, we've written them
Yes,
and had many
I know.
funded. We just have to remember.
Whatever,
when.
it's just an EDA. So they have funds every year to help public entities develop the infrastructure that attracts business, that serves the community, that brings jobs. And you know, it would be great for your organizations, your chambers, and you as the NPOs and for-profit organizations in your community to partner with your city and come up with, you know, do you need a new business park? What about, like, there's maybe the city has a property that needs to be converted, and you've always wanted to put your community center where you serve youth or homeless families, or, you know, whomever it is that you're serving. Like, maybe that you've had your eye on that forever and you want it to be developed, but neither you nor the city has the funds to make that conversion. If you're bringing extra jobs in, like you'd be having an expansion, or maybe there's a group of you that can come to one place, that kind of partnership could really help the city as an applicant get the funding to make the improvements that would benefit you. So that would benefit the whole community, really, and allow you to bring more jobs to the community. So those kinds of partnerships can really take something that's kind of just kind of getting by and turn it into something really amazing. So,
Yes,
and it's not just EDA, but any, you know, I often have been finding in providing homelessness prevention or homeless services to students, it's been amazing to see school districts that are partnering with you know, youth services and homeless prevention and housing services and workforce development. When you get all of them together, you're a powerhouse. And so reach out if you're not already creating these kinds of coalitions. There's so many opportunities that can open up to you when you do form those power partnerships.
Brittany and Mark, for your chamber members, the grant Ashley is referring to, EDA, is a federal grant. We've written dozens of them and had many funded. They're multi-million-dollar grants. They're huge. They're, you know, 150-page, 200-page applications, and they fund offsite and onsite infrastructure for businesses that want to come into a city or that are already in a city and would like to either expand or retain jobs. But in order to come into the city or expand or retain the jobs, the business needs some on-site or off-site infrastructure improvements. They need a extension of a water line, or a wastewater treatment plant expansion, or a street signal, or traffic signals, or any off-site or on-site improvements. EDA is a fantastic grant. We've written many. They have a lot of money this year, last year and this year. They've gotten a lot of money from the various stimulus packages. And so EDA is definitely a grant we write for a city in conjunction with a for-profit business. If that makes sense to Brittany and Mark, maybe it might be of interest for some of your chamber members.
Absolutely, thank you.
You're welcome.
I saw also a question about books that we would recommend. I actually have not found any books on grant writing that that revealed anything other than what I learned through kind of trial by fire. So unfortunately, some of it is just to be learned by experience. There was also a comment about how to write multiple grants so that you can reuse some of the verbiage, and also how to just write really good grants. So my trick is to not fill up the whole space just to fill it up. You don't want to be repetitive unless the grant asks you to be repetitive. So follow all those instructions in the guidelines, what comes to mind when I say unless the grant asks you to be competitive are some mental health grants have very specific guidelines, and you've got to read all of them. There's so much. They're very long. So just give yourself enough time, several hours to read through them and really process what they're saying. Because like on some of these mental health grants, they'll say in name a section 1A and answer this, you know, in half a page, and then in 2A, you have to answer these things, but you can't refer to any documents outside of the space where you're writing. That's an abnormal approach, but it is a specific requirement of that grant. So you need to be familiar with that grant itself. More often, you will have several documents that you prepare, and in your narrative, you can say it once and refer back to where it is. Or you can say a little bit at the beginning and then say more of it where it becomes necessary to go more into detail. And you can also reference other documents. So let's say you are providing a curriculum as part of maybe an after school program that we made our pretend after school program earlier. So instead of having to detail everything in your curriculum, again, in the narrative portion, the part where you're writing the whole story, you can say, give some examples and then refer them over to that curriculum that you've included as an attachment, if that's allowed. I also tend to tailor my level of detail in my narrative based on the narrative length requirement or the number of questions that they have. So as Esther said, if you've got a 55-page narrative and you get done writing your story about your about your program for the grant, and it's only 10 pages, I will tell you, you don't have enough detail. You need to come back in and tell more about how, tell more about who, when, all of those questions, when, where, what, who, and how. And you don't need to fill in the space to have 55 pages, but you need to fill in the space. I would say I could feel happy myself if I got to about 45 pages. I would feel like I've given enough detail. So as long as I'm not just repeating the same thing over and over again. So in those kinds of lengthier things, what you need to do is support your idea by citing like research studies, best practices, explain how you know that this is going to impact the group that you're affecting in a certain way, you know, and doing that through citing research or making connections. If you only have 10 spaces to write and you have come up with a 20-page narrative, now you've got to cut 10 pages out of your narrative. So that's really, really hard to do. I would recommend knowing ahead of time you only have 10 pages and leaving a lot of the other details that we just talked about in that bigger narrative. A lot of those can be left out because clearly they want a more of an overview. At 3 pages, it's hard to tell the story. You know, you don't get very much. So the short ones are almost as hard as the long ones because you need to tell your whole story in a really short space. So it takes a lot of strategy to say what's going to be different. You are special. There's something special about you that you do that almost nobody else in the whole world does. What is that? Make sure they know that. Make sure they know what is special about the community that you're serving. Your community is special and unique, and you have specific issues that you want to address, and they are going to require a different type of solution than another community. And you are well suited to provide that solution. So what you want to say is, here's the problem that our community has. Here's the solution that I want to implement. And here's how we're going to measure that it's going to work. And here's how we know it's going to work, or why we think it's going to work. So you just want to make sure that you're explaining, you know, you paint a picture for someone, like, so that they can basically visualize you swooping in, providing this program, visualize the people experiencing that program and seeing those results of the program. So if you were in a technology program, let's say you've developed a new type of maybe battery to store solar power that's more efficient, like maybe they'll need to be able to see, how is your battery better? Does it last longer? Is it less vulnerable to the elements? Is it more efficient? Like, so can it reduce energy loss? So you want to be able to show them exactly why this is going to be a good thing. Back to our youth program, we want to, maybe the grant wants you to keep these kids from dropping out of school. So you've got to design your program that says, okay, these are the things that we know keep kids from dropping out of school. And so these are the things that we are going to provide. So a mentor, we're going to mentor these kids. They're going to see the same mentor every week on Thursdays for 30 minutes. And then we're all going to go to the park once a month for an hour on Saturday. You know, whatever it is that you're going to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be that specific unless you have to write 55 pages about it. I hope that that wasn't just a big, too much of an information dump, and it gave you some examples of maybe how you could communicate your program to someone who might want to pay to give you money. I do see another question that says, does referring to another section work? Well, I try only to do that when I don't have enough space, because like you mentioned, some people don't want to go over and review that, but you don't want to. So what I do to get around it is like at the beginning, I give kind of a short, like a teaser. We are going to have mentors. And then when I get to the place in the narrative where I really need to explain the mentors, that's where I go into the detail. And then any place else, I would just reference like, you know, maybe as I mentioned, you know, as we discussed, the mentors would do this. So in a lot of the grants that I anticipate you'll be pursuing, you're not going to be having 55 pages to write. So you probably won't be having a lot of other attachments. And then there are some grants that want you to put everything in the narrative. And then there's other grants that really don't want a lot of a narrative. They might want your curriculum, your budget. They might want some vendor quotes. They might want letters of support that tell part of that story too. So that would be from other people, not even you. So some people really want attachments, not words, and other people want words, not attachments. And then circling back to one of the questions that I was trying to address before I got to off on a tangent. When you are writing your grant, it really should be very tailored to that specific grant. So it should be tailored to that project in that grant. In some circumstances, you won't be able to reuse it because it's too specific. But in general, like your background information on your project, your background information on your community, a lot of those will be transferable. And that's the kind of place where you would be able to transfer to another application.
Thank you.
Brittany, I think we've wrapped up our questions, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add one thing we didn't touch on. We covered a lot. I don't think we touched on contacting the federal or state agencies after you receive notice from the agency that you've been declined and asking for the scoring sheet. That's very helpful to obtain the score sheet so you know where you were weak and where you were strong and where you can improve next time should you decide to apply for the grant again in future years. Federal and state grant applications are generally speaking public information. And if you request a copy of the score sheet and you do a Freedom of Information Act request if you have to, they will give it to you. It may take a few calls or emails, but normally you will be able to receive the score sheet back and see where you scored well and where you can improve. So that's also something that we have as one of our best practices at California Consulting. When we do not receive an award, we want to know why, and we want to know how we can write it better for our client the next time around. So unless there's anything else, Brittany, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I think we've covered all the questions.
Yeah, I don't see anything else coming through that hasn't been answered. Yeah, I mean, Ashley, if you just or Steve, if you want to leave us with kind of the number one mistake people make when they're writing grants and the best thing that they can do when they're writing grants. And I think that will probably sum us up here.
Best thing that they can do when they're writing grants, I'll give my answer. Read the guidelines thoroughly and comprehensively before you start. How about you, Ashley?
Oh, definitely the guidelines. Follow the instructions. So in those guidelines, not to scare you off, but some of them even say things like you need to use Times New Roman, size 11 font, single spacing, 1-inch margins, and they measure. So some of them
Blue
are like that.
and sign in blue ink only or black ink only.
Oh yeah, and the one you do today is going to be different than the one you do next week. So guidelines. Because in some circumstances, those will disqualify you, and then that's like the heartbreaker right there. So don't make that mistake. And then I would say that exaggeration, or also on the opposite side, like kind of feeling like everybody's doing this, it's not special. Either extreme is, I would say, a mistake that people make. You should have confidence in your uniqueness, and spend some time selling yourself, basically. That you need to convince them of why you are special.
Excellent. Okay, well, I don't know if Shasta wants to jump back in, but if not, I will say thank you, California Consulting, for sharing best practices with us and the 101 grant writing webinar. And thank you everyone else for tuning in. Again, this has been live streamed onto the Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce Facebook page and will be available for later viewing on the Morgan Hill Chamber of Commerce YouTube page.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everyone.
Thank you.